Hi and welcome to this video in the MRDCL Fundamentals series, in which we look at format options in MRDCL. You'll find the files that have been used in this video in the folder tab 06. Now, format options have been covered in previous videos, but we can look at them in a little bit more depth in this video. But just quickly to recap some of the things that have been mentioned in previous videos. So if I open up this STP file here, and I go to the table stage, that's where most format options get applied. There are some format options that you use in the data stage, but most of them apply to the table stage. Now, there's one thing that's worth mentioning here before we go too much further, is that when you're using format options, as I say, they typically apply to tables, but there are times when you might want to move them to your data stage. And the reason for that is, or the usual reason for that, is that if you want to export the project into Reflect, you might find that by leaving the table stage, or you will find by leaving the table stage, that they won't take any effect in the Reflect file. So if you want to have format options that affect the way that users in Reflect will find variables or tables when they're running, you need to move them. I typically put them at the bottom of the data stage, so I just copy them back here. And indeed, I know some people just do that as a standard thing, put all of their special text, like their titles and their format options, in the bottom of the data stage, which is a perfectly good thing to do because they do carry over into this table stage. All right, so let's look at the different types of format options. Now, format options fall into three categories. There is a batch of format options that take a value. They're called numeric format options, and we've got a couple of examples here. So we've got DPR1. So DPR is the format option. All format options are 3 letters, and the value assigned to that is 1. So this actually means this particular format that we want to set decimal places for ratios or percentages to 1 decimal place. And here's another one behind it, CLW7, so that's setting the column label width to 7 characters. So that's a sort of family of format options that take a numeric value known as numeric format options. Now, there's another batch of format options that are logical format options. In other words, they're true or false. Now, we have one down here. If we look at this table here, it's taking the format option BRS, which means blank row suppression, and you can see it's got no value attached to it. It's either true or it's false. And indeed, to turn it into the opposite, to make it negative, you would put an N on the front, and that would mean not blank or no blank row suppression, so that blank row suppression didn't take place. The third type of format option that you get is character format options, and they take a value as well, but they're taking a character value. So there's only a handful of these. For example, the character for 0 by default is the dash character, so that's what will come out on tables if you have 0 respondents or 0%. But if you wanted to change it to the character 0, you could just do CAS quote, single quote, 0, single quote, comma, and that will change the format option to a 0 rather than a dash. Now, you'll already have noticed that when you want more than one format option, they're separated by a /. There's no other option for that. You must use a /. And if you want to use them on individual tables, you can separate them by a / as well in exactly the same way. And you can mix up logical and numeric ones and character ones, and that's absolutely fine. They apply until you reset them, so there's nothing wrong with having a DPR1 set here, having a couple of tables, now saying you want DPR0, having a couple more tables and changing it to 2. Basically, formats, when they're set like that as global settings, will apply to every table that follows it until further notice. Now, as I mentioned, there are a small number of format options that apply to the data stage, and they control the way that you pick up data. So let's have a look at one or two of those. So if we go to, they mainly apply to integers. So if we look at an integer we've got in this survey here, we have here the number of in the household, which is an integer. Now, what MRDCL will do by default is it will treat blank as 0. So if we wanted to change that, we have a format option called IFBU, which would set blanks to undefined and not treat blank as a 0. Now, there are some occasions when you actually want to treat blank as a 0, if you've got a whole long list of items that you want to ask people how many they bought or whatever it might be, you might find that blank would quite rightly mean 0, but you might want to change that default to undefined. So here, this would treat anybody with blank in the household, not as nobody in the household, but as an undefined number, and then MRDCL would treat it accordingly. It means score calculations and so on, because it excludes null values or undefined values. There's another format option in this family of ones that affect data, like ADF, so that would accept decimals in a field, and there's various other ones, many of which are covered in the video referring to numeric values in MRDCL. Now, the biggest difficulty with format options is two probably areas. One is that every format option has its default, so you have to know what they are set to by default. Another problem is that there are just so many of them. There's over 200 format options, which makes it very difficult to learn all of them just quickly, and certainly we're not going to do a video on that just here now, where we're going to run through all 200 of those, although I'm going to give you some guidance on that in a second. The other issue is that many of the format options apply to tables that you produce in a text format. Now, there's two ways of running tables, as you probably know. You can either produce tables in a TXT format, or with this run control parameter or one of its other variants, but one of the CSV options, you can get tables out in a spreadsheet as well. Now, many of the format options will not apply to the tables in a CSV file, because a CSV file already has its rules on how it spaces things out and how it's storing things. So setting a column label width of 7 characters, for example, would have an effect in a text file, because there the text needs to wrap around, but in a CSV file it will just come out in the cell in the table as one piece of text, regardless of what CLW setting you have. So you have to be careful with when using MRDCL formats. There are many that don't apply to CSV tables, and for very good reason, because a CSV file or a spreadsheet file is very much constructed as a matrix of cells, whereas a text output is obviously much more free format, and it is a document to be printed. Let's just see that in action. We have got a CLW of 7 here. So if I run this, I look at my tables, I've got a column label width of 7 here, so the word female does print out perfectly well. If it was the default, which is 5 characters, it would wrap that around and put female over 2 lines. If I go to my tables now and look at the CSV version of that, we'll quickly look at that, and you can see it really doesn't matter how many characters it is here. It's going to just fit it in anyway into one cell. So if there's a very long piece of text here, it's going to still fit it in. And for example, that number in the household there is just fitting in as one piece of text, even if it didn't really fit in to the cells that have been allocated. So there is a difference, and those differences mean that many format options only apply to text tables. All right, let's go back to our script and let's start to look at perhaps how we can find out more about these format options. Now, there isn't a magic solution here. Users are many and varied of our software, and some people use format options regularly that others never touch, and so it's very hard to come up with a general set of rules to say, well, these are the format options that you need to look at. The way you can find out more about the format options, and perhaps it's something that you might want to spend an hour going through all the options so you can see what's there, is to click on the help, click on the format, the command language help index. In the search, put formats category, and you'll see that what comes up here is an option to select formats by category. Now this actually helps you to navigate where all the format options are, particularly once you know your way around a little bit. So once you've perhaps looked around this once, you'll find it much easier to navigate and find how you use each format. So there's a set here. I'm going to run through each of these sets fairly quickly, but just give you an idea of what's in there. So there's a set called widths and indents, and these mainly apply to the widths of rows, columns, the margin, which mainly are to do with how you output to a text file. So these really are quite focused on a text file because, as I mentioned, a spreadsheet is much more measured in the sense that each cell contains a piece of information, whereas a text file is effectively in more free format, and so the data has to be split up in a more intelligible way so that it prints out in a way that can be used. So we've got some examples here, and they're quite detailed, some of these. So we've got the column header gap. That specifies the gap between each column header. And if we want to know what the default is, we can click on it and we can see that the default is 3 characters. So there's a gap of 3 characters between each column heading. And it also lists down here in this help other formats that are very closely linked to that, like column label gap and the column label width. So there is the column label gap. So that's the gap between each column in a text table. Column label width we've looked at just now, which is the actual width of each column in a table. And you can see the sort of detail that you can get down to in these. So whether you want to center all your footnotes, if you select this option CNF, you can see by default it's turned off. So that would be the default setting, NCNF. So if you don't want your footnote centered, you don't need to do anything because it's doing it all for you. If you wanted to center your footnotes, you would need to have a format option CNF, so it centered them for you. You can center all your titles so they appear in the center of the page. Horizontal alignment spacing shows how, when you do horizontal percentages horizontally alongside the figures, which is activated by format HAL, you can also decide what the space is between those. It's not a very common use format, and you can quickly get an impression here that you get very detailed settings that you can make. Indentations after the job header. So when you want to position your job header, do you want to put it in a precise place on the page in the text format? So these options here control exactly how a page looks, predominantly for a text output. You've also got some warnings here if text gets split. So by default, you can see that you don't get a warning when texts are being split. But if you wanted to know how texts are going to be split when you're running a set of tables that you're very keen on they look in a particular way, you would use the format WST. So you've got warnings in your listing file, and then you could actually correct them or change them if you wanted to. So that's the first set of formats that we've gone through. Let's look at the next one. And line spacing are a similar bunch that mainly reflect what happens in a text file. So we've got the lines before a job header, the lines after a header, and all those sorts of things which will let you control exactly what a page looks like if you're going to print it from a TXT file. So most of these are only relevant to TXT output. So these are lines and line spacing. Let's go back again. Now figures tend to apply to both text files, table files, and CSV table files. And we looked at one earlier, CAZ for the character for 0. We've got other options here. The character for nearly 0 is an asterisk. Again, you'll see here if we select this one is a character format, which is what every format tells you what a type it is, and then it tells me the default setting is CNZ single quote star quote. And if you wanted to have a star, which is the default, you don't need to have that format option. If you wanted some other character there, I don't know what you might choose. Let's say you wanted an ampersand there, you could choose that character and it would come out for you on your tables. You've got some other options here that control figures. One that I would always point out is DBL. That's double precision, That's certainly one that I use when I'm doing weighted data where you want accurate figures to several decimal places. So that's DBL, that's one that I often use. DPR we looked at just now for decimal places for percentages or ratios. You can set decimal places for statistics with DPS, although that doesn't affect the averages. Decimal places for tables, if you've got weighted data or you're showing your data in thousands, you might want to show data in thousands to one decimal place. And a number of other ones here, so you can show here things like whether you show the percentage sign or not. Some people, if you're doing percentage only tables, don't want to see the percentage sign. This is a logical format which is set to true, so by default you do see the percentage sign on output tables. If you wanted to turn it off, you would go NPCS and that would remove it for you. You can put parentheses around negative numbers, and again you've got a whole set of options here for percentaging horizontally. By default you don't get horizontal percentages, but if you wanted them you would have RTH and that would give you horizontal percentages. RTT percentages on the top left cell of the table. RTV is vertical percentages, which by default is turned on. SFX scales tables so that they're shown in terms of hundreds or thousands if you perhaps got large bases. So again, a whole long list here of options that control figures. Then we come to statistics, and there's another long list here of options that affect statistics. Some of these are true false, so many of them are logical ones, like you either have a mean score or you don't. You can choose a standard deviation or you can turn it off. Others take values, so you can decide how many decimal places you want for your averages with DPA, so that would set the default for you. By default it's one decimal place, but if you wanted to change it to 2, for example, you could set DPA to 2 for either all your tables or one table. And you'll see other format options here to enable statistical options such as Mann-Whitney-Wilcoxon tests. We looked at standard deviation and standard error, KS tests, medians, modes, and so on. So there's a whole raft of different options here that you can use which produce statistics on tables. So this is the group to look at if you want to enable or set statistics. Total rows and columns, slightly shorter list here. So this tells MRDCL whether you want to show a total column, whether you want to hide it, whether you want to increment the total column, whether you want to see an unweighted total column, an unweighted total row, whether you want to base your tables on all answering, that's ANR at the top there. So a number of options that control total rows and total columns, both whether they appear on overflow tables, for example, and how they behave in tables. On to the next list, minimum value suppress. This is quite a short list, so we saw BRS earlier on, so this suppresses blank rows. BCS does the same with suppressing blank columns, so rather than having lots of blank columns on a table, you can make your output a bit more condensed if you suppress blank columns. I think people typically do. BTS will suppress blank tables, so if you ran a set of tables on a large number of filters that may be 0, for example, you could suppress the blank tables so that they just disappeared rather than have pages and pages of tables that had bases of zeros and were empty. And again, you can set minimum columns for bases, minimum columns where a column is suppressed. If you want to hide bases in a column where the sample size is less than 5, which is sometimes done to make sure that respondents remain anonymous, you can use that option there so that the data is removed from the table. Then we've got some compile options. These are fairly less commonly used, so these are to set characters for delimiters. Now, for example, the character for delimiting items we've seen is a semicolon. You can change that to another character. I don't advise that, because if you set it to a character that's already used for something else, you may get a conflict. But if you're familiar with other software, you may want to put in a procedure where everybody uses a particular character. I certainly recommend that teams that work together all adopt the same delimiters for characters and for headings and so on, because otherwise it makes scripts very difficult to read if you're not if they're not in a familiar format. LST is quite a useful one. I do like this one. If I've got a very big script, it's possible, and I know it compiles, it's possible to stop that writing out to the LST file, which not only saves runtime, but makes the list file much more manageable. So if I've got a very big script, which perhaps in the preprocessor it's producing hundreds of thousands of lines, which can happen, you can suppress it with nlist, NLST, I mean by that, which will reduce the size of the output considerably and speed the run up. So there's some useful things there. And there's a series of warnings which you can have or suppress as you wish to. So if you redefine tables, for example, we've done some redefined tables in other videos, you don't normally get a warning for that, but you could turn that on if you thought there were no redefined tables in your script, so that you would know if you'd accidentally, for example, redefined a table. Execution, there's a short list here. Some of these we've seen already, like IFB and IFF to handle numeric fields, and ADF to accept decimals in fields, ABF. So there's a few here that refer to how fields are picked up. And there's a small number of other ones here that allow you to truncate integer arithmetic. So that, for example, if you divide 5 by 3, rather than rounding that in an integer to a value of 2, you can truncate it to a value of 1, so it rounds down rather than rounding to the nearest whole number. So there's a few options there under execution controls. And finally, I'm afraid there's a reasonably long list under miscellaneous, and they cover different things to do with putting dates on tables, how you handle continuation tables, automatic table numbering, whether you print horizontal titles, and various other options that you might want for underlining and so on in your script. So they're a bit of a mixed bag. Now, as I say, I couldn't go through all of those in one video. There are over 200. I think it's something that you have to search for yourself, and once you've done that, you can then probably pick maybe 50 or whatever it is that become your key list that you can use and have as a sort of crib sheet, perhaps on your wall, or share with colleagues. So that's an introduction to format options. I hope that was useful. We certainly didn't cover everything in the program. I hope I pointed out some things and some things to be cautious about, particularly in terms of how some only work in TXT tables, and that's for good reason. I hope the video was useful. Thank you.